In this short introduction I will try to explain what human rights are by looking into its history. Human rights were always reactions against exploitation of human beings, oppression and other forms of injustices. And they were usually achieved by means of revolutionary changes. The so-called first generation of human rights, civil and political rights, was the result of bourgeois revolutions, starting with the French and the American revolutions in the late 18th century and many similar revolutions during the 19th century. They are based on the doctrine of natural law, the rationalism, the Enlightenment. Philosophers such as John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Paine and others were developing these ideas of civil rights to life, property, liberty, equality, security, freedom of expression, and political rights are the rights to political and democratic participation, to vote, to be elected, to have equal access to public service. In reality, although equality was stressed that much in the French Revolution, these were the rights of white, male, well-educated persons with property. So it means the big majority of the population, women, children, the working class, the poor, were not covered by the bourgeois concept of human rights. In the United States, equality was even seen to be compatible with slavery, because slaves were not seen as human beings. So it took until the Civil War in the 1860s that slavery was finally abolished. During the 19th century also the social movement started. Marx criticized these human rights as a bourgeois concept. And already in the late 19th century, for instance, Otto von Bismarck in Germany introduced social insurance, the social security policies, in order to react to the demands of the working class. And in the early 20th century we had kind of revolutions in Mexico, for instance. The German Weimar Republic created also economic, social and cultural rights, the so-called second generation of human rights, and above all after the Russian Revolution in the Soviet Union. It is based on the idea that first and foremost states have a responsibility to create the conditions that people can live in dignity and enjoy the civil and political rights. But for that they need a certain security, social security. They need the right to work, to be sure that they have a job, right to housing, to have a minimum standard of living, the right to health, the right to education. So these are seen as a second type of human rights that needed a strong positive action by the state. In the first half of the 20th century, people suffered because of World War I, and also in this 1920s and 30s because of the world economic crisis that led also to the rise of fascism in Italy, in Spain, and above all, of course, in Germany and Austria, where Adolf Hitler established a system of racism by the Nazis that finally led to the worst crime in human history, the Holocaust or Shoah. This again prompted another revolution, at this time at the international level. Already during the war, Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed that after they defeat Germany and its allies, Japan in particular, they would then establish a new international world order based on human rights and democracy. And that was done by establishing immediately after the end of World War II, in June 1945, the United Nations with three main objectives. International peace and security, which meant for the first time in history outlawing war and armed conflicts. Second, development, economic and social development, and eradication of poverty and eradication of colonialism. And the third main objective is human rights, based on human dignity. Already in two 2 or 3 years, the Commission on Human Rights, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of Franklin Roosevelt, this Commission on Human Rights, which was composed of states, not only the United States and other Western states, also China, the Soviet Union, Saudi Arabia or South Africa, were agreeing on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was solemnly adopted by the General Assembly on 10 December 1948 in Paris. The Universal Declaration is still the most important document of the United Nations. It inspired many newly independent states in Africa and Asia, and it is the cornerstone of the human rights system of the United Nations. But it's not legally binding. So governments tried then to develop legally binding human rights treaties, a universal convention on human rights, but the Western states said no. We have to split them. The economic, social and cultural rights are not really human rights. That's why we need a covenant on civil and political rights, which is the real human rights covenant, and then a covenant on economic, social and cultural rights. Both treaties formed the International Bill of Rights and were adopted in December 1966 by the General Assembly and entered into force in 1976. And that was the beginning also of international monitoring of states' compliance. The Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and many other committees, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, on racial discrimination, discrimination against women, enforced disappearances, the rights of persons with disabilities. Those are all monitoring bodies based on special treaties of the United Nations codifying human rights. And similar movements were on the regional level, first in Europe with the European Convention and the European Court of Human Rights, that is handing down binding judgments in thousands of cases every year, where states are told you are violating human rights, you have to pay compensation to the victims, and you have to change your laws and practices that lead to human rights violations. Similar developments we have with the American Convention and the Inter-American Commission and Court of Human Rights in the American Hemisphere, but also in Africa with the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the African Commission and Court. You see already in the name, human and people's rights is not only individual rights, it's also collective rights of peoples to self-determination, independence, economic independence, development, a healthy environment and peace. So individual and collective rights of the so-called third generation. So the second half of the 20th century can also be seen as a time of codification, so that human rights were developed into a universal concept that was legally binding on all states of the world. With the end of the Cold War in 1989, the implosion of the communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, above all the Soviet Union, a new window of opportunity opened. And that was leading to the convening of the Second World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, where all the states of that time were enacting the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, which is the basis for the United Nations Human Rights Protection System, afterwards under the lead of the High Commissioner on Human Rights in Geneva. And it states clearly that all human rights are universal. So that's a reaction to China and others who have said that human rights is only a Western concept. No, it's a universal concept, binding on all states. But at the same time, all human rights are also interdependent, indivisible and equal. So that means economic, social and cultural rights are equally important to civil and political rights. However, in the same year, 1989, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank adopted the Washington Consensus, saying that the neoliberal economic policies are taking over from the old policies of state intervention based on the theory of John Maynard Keynes. That means large-scale privatization, deregulation and minimizing the role of the state in times of globalization and digitalization. And that led to major crisis situations in the 21st century, starting with the economic crisis that culminated in 2008, the global financial crisis, the food crisis, the water crisis, the rising inequality between the rich and the poor, but also rich and poor countries, the climate crisis that leads to the rising temperatures and also the rising sea level that is endangering really the very survival of Mother Earth. That led also to the rise of populism, because right-wing politicians have then easy answers. They have always scapegoats like migrants and refugees. They're not asking, why are there more refugees today than ever after World War II? Because of so many armed conflicts that are often fought in the interests of transnational corporations. Whether we look into the Great Lakes region, the Democratic Republic of Congo, but of course also in the Middle East, where we have so bloody armed conflict in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, etc. But it might also be poverty, it might also be climate change that is forcing people to leave their homes and look for a better future in the rich countries, and the rich countries are reacting by closing the borders, etc. So we are living at a time when human rights and democracy are put in question, and we need to have a new impetus, a new revolution if you so want, where human rights can become the cornerstone. And that also is shown by the current situation of the coronavirus pandemic, where states all of a sudden, in order to protect the right to life and the right to health, are starting with massive interventions and restrictions of classical human rights and freedoms, like the right to personal liberty. We are told that we should stay home in quarantine in order to prevent the spreading of the virus. Or freedom of movement, we are not allowed to go to public places. The right to privacy, the right to freedom of assembly, there are no more public gatherings, etc. The right to property, the right to economic activity, because the economy is shut down to much extent. And what kind of lessons shall we draw? There are some who say, okay, the authoritarian regimes that are not really hampered by human rights, like China, like Singapore and others, they dealt in the best way with the coronavirus pandemic. So we should follow them. But others feel no, we should draw different conclusions. That states realized that those that were cutting most down because of neoliberal policies on social security and public health have now more problems to deal with the pandemic than other states that still kept a kind of a minimum of public health and social security. And perhaps these lessons should be learned also to deal with the major challenges of the 21st century, in particular the climate challenge. And states in 2015 adopted the Agenda 2030 with 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are very similar to human rights. The eradication of poverty, equality between men and women. Every child should have access to education, to a functioning health system. We should drastically reduce economic inequality and do much more in order to save the ecological crisis. That needs to be achieved by 2030. And human rights as binding international obligations are the best tools to advocate change. And that's why we need more than ever human rights, democracy and the rule of law in order to save the planet for our children and future generations.